Well, good evening, everyone. My name is John Highbush. I have the honor of being the executive director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. It's great to have all of you here this evening. In honor of our men and women in uniform who defend our freedom around the world every day, if you would please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thanks. Please be seated. Before we get started tonight, we have a special guest. I'd like to make sure I recognize him. He's one of my bosses. He's on the Reagan Foundation Board of Trustees. He's also formerly of Ronald Reagan's national security staff, Mr. Michael Kestine. Michael, would you say hello? Great. Now, I have had the honor of introducing our special guest this evening before. Her previous visit to the Reagan Library at the time was to promote her newest book, one that is entitled Patriotic Grace. Now that book joined 7 other bestsellers before it that she'd written during an extraordinary writing career. It offered valuable insight into a time in America that few writers, if any, had been able to capture before. Now, if history is a good judge of these things, and I believe that it is, the book Peggy Noonan has brought with her tonight, entitled The Time of Our Lives, is certain to follow suit in terms of well-deserved success. Now, speaking of history, as all of you know, we live in an age when the internet and a vast and growing number of media outlets, such as Netflix, make it possible now to do something we call binge. And that is the opportunity, if one seizes it, to compress an entire season or more of their favorite TV shows into a day or two. No longer does one need to wait patiently for a favorite program to unfold every Tuesday night, one episode at a time, to see an entire season that might normally run for many months or even a year. Similarly, Peggy has done us all a real favor, and I'll tell you why. Fridays are my favorite day of the week, and I'm sure the same is true for many of you. And thankfully, as sure as the sun is to rise on a Friday morning, so too will the Wall Street Journal publish about 500 to 750 words of observation and wisdom of one Margaret Ellen Peggy Noonan. And here's where we are indebted to her. Finally, after many years of consistently producing one of the most successful and praised newspaper columns of our times, she has culled through this remarkable body of work and given us the opportunity to binge read. And that's what the time of our lives is all about. The time of our lives, it really is a collection of Peggy's greatest hits. It's all in one place. And for all you fans of Peggy, I know you will appreciate how she's categorized her most salient works. The beginning of each chapter gives us new insight as to the many themes she has chosen to weave throughout her lifetime of work and why. So no doubt, many here know of Peggy far beyond her work at the Journal. You very likely know her as one of the most famous and talented of President Reagan's speechwriters. You may know that Peggy has been a dear friend of Mrs. Reagan for many years. And you may know that she volunteers her time to this day serving as a trustee of President Reagan's foundation. But here's a bit of trivia you might not know. I hope that she does. Peggy has been a true hero of mine for many years. She has been an inspiration to me, and I know to all of the staff here at the Reagan Library. I admire her, we admire her like no other. So ladies and gentlemen, if you would, please join me in welcoming to the stage Peggy Noonan.
can't shake your hand. I have to love you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out here tonight. I know traffic was heavy. Apparently, I was told in California, Thursday night is becoming traffic night, not Friday anymore. So I kind of worried, I was a little bit nervous, as John knows, about whether or not anybody would be here. Thank you for being here. Thank you for coming. Normally I say of beautiful introductions that I don't deserve those kind words, but then I have arthritis and I don't deserve that either, so what the hell? But Highbush deserves more. John Highbush inspires me. He is gallant. He is calm. He is a natural leader of this place. You know, the Reagan Library, it's physically large, but it also has a lot of people involved in it. It has a lot of people who have to be kept up with a sense of mission, kept up with a sense of the meaning of this place. They have to be inspired every day. And John does that, and he does it for me as a friend also. So apart from the fact that I love him because he's wonderful, I admire him deeply as a leader. And I don't think I've ever said that before, and I just wanted to say it. I like to come here. I come here a lot when I don't speak. I like to go through everything here. I like to go through the exhibits. Frankly, I like to make sure everything's up to par. It always is. I go into the gift shop and make sure I like all the gifts. I want them to be little, sparkly, inexpensive things over here and beautiful, elegant, distinguished things over here. I want everybody to be able to walk in there and get something that they want that speaks to them. So I just like being here, but also when my first book came out, I was working on it in 1988 and 89 and 90, and the Reagan Library didn't really exist, and the Reagan archives were hard to get to. And I had to do that book without coming out here and doing research. But that was okay, it was a personal story anyway, and I had so many of my own papers. But for my book that was a biography of Ronald Reagan, when character was king, I had to come out here and spend a considerable amount of time. And so I got to know the archives here. I got to know the part of the library that is not the above ground part that we all see, but the scholars part downstairs. And it worked so well. And I just, in those days, got to know a bunch of people here and kept coming back. And so I always have the sensation of coming home when I am here. And that's funny for me because I'm from New York City and that's where I'm usually at home. But outside of that, the only place I sort of feel at home is right here. So it's an honor to be here, as always. I'll tell you, right before I came on, the Reagan Foundation, Reagan Library website, as I think you know, has a lot going on. And one of the things they've been doing for the past year or so is videotape people who worked with Ronald Reagan or were friends with Ronald Reagan and have just remembrances of him. Today, or at least they've asked me to be part of funny stories about Reagan. And so right before I came on, we taped some stuff, and I found that it wasn't so much funny stories that I had about him as a memory of the air and the tone and the feel of his White House. All White Houses have their own weather, if you will. They have their own environment, and it's sort of set up by the president and by his personality. A president's personality and character sort of filter down and create the air of a White House. I have seen some White Houses where the people in those White Houses, the staffers for the president, had a feeling of too great an awe for the president, too great a sense that he was a godlike figure. In the Reagan White House, we loved Ronald Reagan. We believed in Ronald Reagan. That's why we were there. But apart from that, it was a very funny and comical White House. It was a place where you completely felt free to tease the president. He felt free to tease you. We didn't take a sort of formal approach to him, didn't treat him like a god. I told the story in my first book that there was a young woman in our speechwriting department who sort of captured part of the spirit just by something she did every time the president's helicopter would land at the White House. The president would go away for a few days or a few weeks on some big trip. We'd all miss him when he was gone. Then we'd hear he'd come back to Andrews Air Force Base, and then he'd take a helicopter to the White House from there. And at the moment, he was close enough to the White House that we'd start to hear the whirring of the blades of the helicopter. We'd all sort of stop and look up. And the secretary in the speechwriting department would merrily chirp out, "Daddy's home." And it was so affectionate and yet spoofing of the affection that we all felt. It was really, I don't know, just something that I always remember when I remember that White House. I also mentioned in the videotape, this was part of the feeling of that place. If you were walking through the White House on your way to some office, on your way to pick up or deliver a paper, you'd always assume the president was in the Oval Office, but sometimes he wasn't. Sometimes he'd go walking. You didn't know necessarily where he was. You always knew that Ronald Reagan was coming your way or about to turn a corner and go down your hall, because suddenly you would hear laughter. Laughter is the sound that always announced him. It was kind of a merry, joyful sound. It was Reagan making jokes with his Secret Service detail, or Reagan making jokes with an aide, or Reagan teasing somebody, or somebody teasing him. But when I see these sort of awe-filled White Houses now that seem so dreadfully self-important and aware of their own importance, I find myself moved by the memory of, God, we had a lighter touch, and you knew the president was coming because people were laughing. It was merry. It just was. I want to say one thing about Nancy Reagan, then I'm going to mention one thing about the book, and then I think I'm going to sit down and talk with John. About Nancy Reagan, I always go see her. I always try to go see her when I am out here. I love her and I honor her. There are many things that can be said about her. She is loyal. She is smart. She has a sly sense of humor. She enjoys a little gossip. She's fun. But I think at the end, she will be summed up, or at least I will probably sum her up in these words: she was a tough little patriot. This woman was a real patriot. This woman helped an American president in the last part of his life, in the later part of his life, when he was in his 70s, when normally people are hoping for retirement. He was very much not able to take retirement. She helped him live out and live through not only one of the most demanding presidencies of the modern era, but probably the last successful, unambiguously successful presidency of our time. She helped him do that. And when he was really old, finally actually seemed old and was ill, that tough little patriot protected him and took care of him and was good to him and always saw to it that his privacy and dignity were maintained and protected. The greatest work she has done is work that is unspoken of. There's a great deal to say for this lady, and I hope on this trip I will get to go see her again, because frankly, I could use some good gossip. Now, I'm just going to sum up with a few words on my book. John was so very complimentary about it. I'll tell you what I did. Over the past few years, publishers have come to me now and then and said, do a collection. And I never quite wanted to do it. I think in part because it felt a little final. I felt like, oh, if you do a collection, that sort of sounds like the end of something. So I never wanted to do it. But finally, a particular publisher and a particular friend came to me and said, look, don't agree to a collection, but why don't you just go through all the work you've done the past 35 years, from CBS to the Reagan White House, to the books you've written, to columns and op-ed pieces and essays. Just go through what you've got and see if you think any of it would be worthy to put in a book. It sounded a little challenging. I thought, of course there's something there that's worthy to be put in a book. So I wound up, I went to the backs of the closets where I had boxes of stuff I had written, and I went to warehouses where I had other things I had written. I went through my papers, and I found stuff that to me was so amazing because it was columns and op-eds and essays that were written 20 years ago and 10 years ago that seemed to me actually to be pertinent to the world we're living in now. The things I was discussing then are the things in my column I am discussing now. Great races for the presidency, the greatness game as various political figures try to put themselves high and try to get the backing of the American people for their leadership. America's culture, America's immigrants, what it is we say to each other when we talk about politics in America. So this publisher was really psychologically acute. He said, why don't you sort of separate what you really like from what you don't like that much? And I started to do it. And then I took what I really liked, and then he said, why don't you take what you really love? And then I took little pieces out of that, and by then we had a bunch of manuscript about that big. Then I agreed to do the book. Then we cut it down to about that big. And it's been a delight to me. It was the easiest book to put together of any book I've ever done, although it has an introduction that is brand new and that is about 15,000 words long and that is about the meaning of work and what it is to be a writer and what writers are trying to do. But by the end, this was very much a labor of love for me. I called it The Time of Our Lives because I have been impressed for many years by the observation of an anthropologist and writer named Lawrence Vanderpost, who once said, I read this, believe it or not, in a biography of the great psychoanalytical figure Carl Jung, who was friends with Vanderpost. But Vanderpost said to Jung, the thing we must remember each day is that you're living not only your own life, but the life of your times. You're not just living your life, you are living the life of the era in which you live. His implication, what he was implying was, pitch in, become part, try to make it better. Realize you're part of something big, that this is all a great endeavor we're involved in. That struck me very hard. I think that is what all writers are trying to do, pitch in and become part of things. I also, as an epigraph in the book, quote Pope John the 23rd, who just said one day in a mass in a homily, do not go through life without leaving worthy evidence of your passage. So both of these things I quote. I decided I didn't want to call the book Worthy Evidence of Your Passage. So I called it The Time of Our Lives. But both of those quotes are very much on my mind as I do my work. Something tells me they're probably very much on your minds as you go, one way or another, as you go through your days. Anyway, I don't believe in being subtle. I believe in being direct. Please buy my book. Thank you all. I consider laughter to be agreement, so thank you. And now I'm going to sit and talk with John. Thank you, sir. They're taking my podium away. I didn't know I was supposed to speak tonight. I think I forgot to ask. This was my speech.
And these are her questions.
So hi, Bush. Do you like what I said about you?
That's ridiculously generous.
Did you know I find you gallant? I do.
I am so happy we're filming this.
Did you know John is a writer also? John writes novels.
He does. Coming to a bookstore near you soon.
Yeah. The one I was allowed to read part of is very good.
Thanks, Peggy. I think what I like to do is ask 4 or 5 questions, and then if you're okay with it, Peggy, we'll just turn it to the audience, and they always seem to ask better questions than I do. And my first question is, the book is just chock full of a lot of things, but certainly a great preponderance of it is your columns over the years. And I wonder, this is almost always an unfair question to ask, but if Congress passed a law, or if you were at the pearly gates and the question to you was, you must identify your personal favorite column of all the ones you've written, are you able to say, yes, it's this one, it's this particular topic?
No. I'll tell you what I can say, though. There are times when you are a regular columnist. Columnists are really essentially reacting to the world around them in real time. I talk a little bit in the book about how I approach the idea of writing, which is, it's not detached. I put it has been my way forever to put my heart and soul and spirit and psyche and observational qualities, whatever I got in me, I throw it into that column. That's how I write it. Then I go have a cup of coffee and I cool down, and then I edit it. Do you know what I mean? You have to allow yourself, don't let the creative part of you get mugged by the critical part of you when you're attempting to be creative. Put the critical part aside, just let it rip. Then after you've done that, you let the critical part come in, and you say, that's not quite right, or that didn't work, or something about that isn't right, or that doesn't belong there. But that's how I go through my work. And I also I respond very much to the world around me, to what I see. I respond to it. So I cannot tell you a favorite column, but I can tell you that I have some favorite eras, if you will. In the 12 months after 9/11, after 9/11/01, I was in New York. I had some personal experiences with it. I lost some people I knew. It was New York and Washington were both hit, but it was New York that saw the buildings come down, and it was New York that saw a very special era psychically end. It hit us like a blow to the heart. We lost about 350 firemen, which was impossible. Over the next few days after 9/11, the numbers started to come in on the number of firemen they couldn't find, and it was 50, and then it was 75, and then it was 100. It couldn't have been that many men that we lost, and then it turned out to be, I think 343 was the number. Anyway, we were concussed. It was a blow to the heart, and it was a blow to my heart, and I took it as a human event, a political event, a cultural event, a religious event. I took it as everything. And I worked out my thoughts, my observations, and my feelings every week after 9/11 in a series of columns. And a very beautiful and important thing happened to me during them. The internet really took off for most Americans about the year 2000. That's when most everybody was really getting online, about 15 years ago, and everybody's starting to get computers. Not necessarily computer phones, but everybody's online. It was a brave new world. I saw, since my column had started in the year 2000, and it was only online in those days, I saw that immediately after I'd write a column, that comments would come in. And you know, in the original days before 9/11, the comments were lighthearted, and they're usually negative. People usually react to something like a column or an essay, if they're going to bother to react, usually with a certain amount of negativity. And I was shocked that a column would go up at midnight, and at 12:03 a.m. there'd be a comment. And I'd go to it so happily, and somebody would say, "You are the biggest idiot. Why don't they fire you? Get the heck out of here." So that was my introduction to comment land. But after 9/11, something else happened, something very different. A community of people who were reacting like me every day and every week, and grieving like me, and trying to figure out intellectually what the United States should do, and just experiencing it, they started gathering around my column, thousands of people. I would hear from them, and they would share their experiences, and they would say the most extraordinary things. They would tell me fabulous stories. And it was the first time I ever experienced for me on the internet, a community being born around what I was writing. I still write to some of the people. I got their email addresses and am friends with them. But I'm telling you, we all got through 9/11 together on these silly computers. A bunch of strangers, thousands of us.
Very neat. Peggy, you talked about first you throw your heart into your column, and then you go back and discipline yourself and cull it that way. I've talked with you a long time ago. I wonder if you might share with the audience. I had a minor league role. I used to write a weekly column, but I would bite my nails to the edge because I had to deliver every single Friday, 500 words, and I had to do it right. And I wondered, in your case, you're at the top of the major leagues. Many people in the nation wait to hear what you have to say each week, and I'm wondering, what's your process through the week? How do you get yourself psyched up and actually produce?
Do you know what's the hardest? There are two hard things about doing a column. One is, what is my thought? You know, you got to have a thought that is worthy of a column, you know, that is worthy of your readers. They're serious people, they're busy people. They don't have time for no thought or frivolity or shallowness or predictable conventional wisdom. They deserve something quality. So the first thing is, okay, what is my thought? Second thing that can be difficult is, what is my subject? There's always a lot going on. Right now, with the political scene, what it is, there's so much going on. I think columnists are a little overwhelmed with the opportunities to say anything. And I just want to, my challenge is, there's so much to write about, but I want to write about what I think is the most important thing. And so it's often on my mind, what's important now that's happening? How do I reduce these nervous points of information into actually a coherent thought that might be important? The column is never not on my mind. I am always thinking of it. I am always writing notes to myself on conversations that I heard that I think are significant, on a meeting with a congressman who says something kind of interesting that tells me about the real mood of, say, the Republican caucus in Congress, a thought that I'm having down the street. Sometimes I'm in such a hurry to get the thought down, I send myself emails. If I'm out with the phone and I have a thought, I will stop on the sidewalk like an idiot, get out my phone, send myself the thought, mail it to myself. By Wednesday, I know what my subject is, and I gather together all of my pertinent notes. And I literally paste into a file the emails I sent myself, the notes I made to myself. I read it all over again, and then I think, what am I saying? And then I realize, wow, I'm saying the Republican Party is falling apart. And so my first sentence, I don't believe in wasting time. I always have this sense of my readers that they are busy. They're concerned. They have lives. They are enmeshed in life. And so I have to not show off and not, be dramatic and not be this and that, but just be very direct. And so the first sentence on such a column might be, the Republican Party is falling apart, new paragraph,
Yeah.
Be direct. as I said, just be direct.
Let's talk about television for a moment.
Talk about what?
Television.
Television.
Your main claim to fame over many years has been the Journal column, but as everyone here knows, they have the opportunity to see you occasionally on one of the Sunday morning shows. And I wonder how do you prepare for those? There's no need to prepare, you're just living life as it is, and whatever question they throw at you, you're just going to give them your answer, or do you actually research and think a whole lot about how you might answer questions that get thrown at you?
I absolutely do. I go on Face the Nation a few Sundays a month, or at least that's the plan. On the Friday before Sunday's live airing of Face the Nation, the producer sends out an email to the people on the panel saying, look, you know what's going on this week. I think we're going to be covering the Russian plane, that went down over Sinai. The latest on the Trump-Carson polls. Carson's pulling ahead of Trump. What's happening in New Hampshire? What do you think of, we may look into Jeb Bush's statements on such and such. Our guest live in the studio is Paul Ryan, and we've taped an interview with Marco Rubio. That might be such, an email you get. I take this all seriously. I'm not a natural on TV. Once I settle, if I'm on a 20-minute segment on TV, 8 minutes in, I've sort of settled down, and I forget I'm on TV, and I'm there, and I'll just answer any question. But on the Sunday shows, the panel goes for about 14, 15, 13 minutes, something like that. And you get thrown the first question, and you sort of want to come through, but in my case, I always feel a certain shyness, under the lights. To get past the shyness, I try to be emphatic, if you know what I mean. You know how sometimes you're shy, and instead of just being quiet, you decide at the dinner party to go, well, actually, my view is, do you know what I mean? And through the emphaticness, I'm sort of hoping I'll get past my self-consciousness. I live in New York, I go down to Washington Saturday afternoon, get there early Saturday evening, stay over in a hotel, and then lay out all my notes. I have notebooks that I carry with me, you know this, you've seen them. And I write down all of my thoughts on New Hampshire, the Russian plane, what Marco Rubio did, what Jeb Bush did, what the polls are saying, et cetera. And I try to reduce it down to the one thing I think is true and hasn't been said yet.
I'll ask one more question and we'll turn to the audience. This is a Ronald Reagan question. I know, Peggy, you worked for him for years, wrote some of his most famous speeches. I know the president's speech from 1984, the Pointe du Hoc speech, the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster speech. You were very close to both President and Mrs. Reagan. Is there a story that you can share that you think would tell the audience all about the man and who he was, something that maybe you experienced with him, or maybe even just that you heard of, through the White House, that is really telling about the kind of man President Reagan was?
Lord Acton once said, "No great men are good men." And that was always sort of accepted, and I assumed it was true, but it was not true of Reagan. He was the first American politician of our time who, for me, turned around that cliche. This was a great man who was a good man. It can get boring about talking about what a good man Reagan was. I'll tell you, that you're making me think of when I was researching When Character Was King. I did what I believe Edmund Morris, who had written the Reagan biography, Dutch, which I had been heavily critical of. I did what I believe he did not do. I went to everybody around Reagan. I went to their oldest friends. I went to a producer who met in Hollywood who met him in the 1930s. I went to people who knew him and I said, just tell me everything and answer this question, this question, this question. Well, they were uniformly admiring interviews. Some people talked about his humor, some people talked about his geniality, some his personal kindness. I mean, this was a man who was always driving his accountants crazy when he was president, because people would slip him letters from Americans who were down on their luck, and Reagan would send a personal check and quietly send it to the poor guy who's down on his luck, out of a job, got a few kids. And then Reagan would dutifully put it in his checking balance book, but his personal finances got all screwed up because anybody who got a check from Ronald Reagan wouldn't cash it. So they'd frame it, and it was a check for $125, and so, you know, the accountants are tearing their hairs out. Other times, people are trying to sell the checks. So it got all very complicated. But when I was doing When Character Was King, finally, and I can't remember who this interview subject was, I wish I did, but finally I met a guy who had met Ronald Reagan and told me a story about how Reagan one night went to a restaurant in California. He was by himself. Maybe it was at the end of a long day. Reagan walks in and he goes up to the desk in the restaurant and he says, Reagan, this is before he's president, probably before he's in politics, and he says, the name is Reagan, I've got a reservation for 1 at 8. And they looked, and there was no reservation for 1 in the book. And it was a very crowded restaurant, very busy night. They couldn't give him a table. Reagan lost his temper. He yelled at the person on the desk. He said, this is unprofessional behavior. I come here all the time. You're really wrong to do this. This is very offensive. Then the manager comes over. Reagan yells at the manager. He was ungracious and impatient. I was so grateful to hear this story. I was so happy about it because I thought, you know, nobody's going to think I'm a fair observer. No one's going to respect me as a reporter or a historian if I just tell you nice stories about Ronald Reagan. So I was so grateful for this story, and I'm writing notes about how rude and bullying he was. And I just smiled, and I said to the person I was interviewing, wow. So what happened afterwards? Any aftermath? And he said, oh yeah, Reagan went back the next day and apologized profusely and said, I'm terribly sorry. I was all wrong, and insisted on seeing the manager shaking his hand, personally apologizing. And I thought, Jesus, my only bad anecdote, and I've lost it. So this was a good man.
Well put. Thanks, Peggy. We'll go to the audience for some questions now. If you have any, else I can ask is if you have a question to raise your hand, and don't start asking the question until we put a microphone in your hand, because we need to pick up the sound of what your question is. Right here. Thank you.
With your years of experience in Washington, I can't help but think that representatives are there too long. Is there any movement whatsoever to cut their terms? We cut our president's terms, but these senators, these leviathans, that all they care about is being there forever, and half of them are incontinent. I mean, it's just, do you have feelings on that?
Well said, young man. What you're talking about is the term limits movement. There is a term limits movement in the United States. There are many people who think a congressman or woman should be limited to 3 terms. A senator should be limited to 2 terms. This would be beneficial to our country because it would mean our governing class wasn't spending all of their time getting reelected. It would mean they had to be serious in the short time that they had there. The suggestion is their motivation might be proving their worth by doing a good job, as opposed to proving their importance by being there for 30 or 40 years and feathering their own nests and becoming more and more detached from the American people. The founders originally assumed that those who govern us would be people living normal lives, having normal professions, coming from normal places in America, having had normal experiences, and then they would, as good citizens and as a gesture of good citizenship, come forward, put themselves forward for office, govern in Congress or in the Senate for a certain amount of time, and then go home and be a normal American again. One of the things about them now is they never go home. They never go home. If they lose office, they stay in Washington and become rich lobbyists. Or, you know, this distressing thing for me as a New Yorker, they leave the White House and they come to New York to live. I do not believe, I would make anybody a $10 bet. I do not believe that when President and Mrs. Obama leave the White House, they will really return to Chicago. They'll go to Chicago for a few minutes. They'll have a house or a condo. He'll have, I suppose, his presidential library out there, but really he'll live in New York, just like Bill Clinton, just like Hillary. I believe it is their plan to surround me. And I will say for Jimmy Carter, God bless him, that man was president of the United States, and then he went home to Plains, Georgia, and lived near the peanut farm, or the peanut factory, whatever the heck it was. You know, George Bush the first went back to Texas. George the second went back to Texas. Ronald Reagan came back to where he came from. I can't stand it that they're so detached from the idea of location, our leaders now, that they don't even go home. Because where is home for them? It's where money and power are. That's a horrible thing. Anyway, the term limits movement took off very big in 1994 and essentially fizzled. Why? Because the idea of term limits would have to be agreed to and put forward in the House and in the Senate. They don't think it's a good idea for some reason. They say you'll lose all our experience. Do you know what I mean? Fine.
Over here? Yeah.
What do you think of the idea that a lot of the press is biased and that is becoming more and more transparent?
The mainstream elite media in the United States has had a liberal tilt as opposed to a conservative tilt all of my life. I started out at CBS in the 70s. I even predicted once, it will change in time, but maybe it will never change. I don't know why that is. I thought there are so many reporters who try very hard to just do a good job and call it as they see it. And they really do not see themselves as of the left as opposed to of the right. That's not their self-conception. They are not registered Democrats. But if you ask them about a series of issues, you know what I mean? They see themselves as just completely fair, unbiased, and attempting to move forward in a very just way. But if you take them aside or get to know them and ask them about their positions on issues, from cultural and social issues straight through to foreign affairs, mysteriously, their responses, when honest, tend to be the responses of a person of the left and not a person of the right. So they don't self-identify as something, but if you ask them their views, you can see sort of where they're coming from. I thought the CNBC debate was just a disaster because the snottiness, you know, there's bias and there's bias, but snot-nosed bias it is actually offensive in a way that will make people sit up and say, that's snot-nosed bias. In a way, I think it will turn out maybe to have a happy ending because it put the issue of bias on the table in a new way at a new moment. So maybe some progress is possible there. But I'll tell you something. I thought Ted Cruz made a real mistake. He said these debates ought to be moderated by moderators who have or may have voted in a Republican primary and voted for a Republican. I got to tell you, I just think that's wrong. I don't care who the moderators vote for. I knew Tim Russert. Tim Russert was a Democrat. Tim Russert got his start in Washington working for Mario Cuomo and Pat Moynihan. He was a liberal Democrat, I would say a moderate liberal Democrat, or a moderate Democrat by the time he died. But I would trust him to moderate anything. He knew how to be, didn't matter he's a Democrat, he knew how to be fair. He knew how to be not phonily respectful, but appropriately respectful to grown-ups running for the office of President of the United States. He knew not to be trivializing in his approach and ask trivial questions. He could be mischievous, he would grill people, but I believe he tried very hard to grill Republicans and Democrats to the same degree and in the same way. I think he succeeded imperfectly, as we all do, but I think he was always trying to be fair. I will tell you, as a conservative, being a conservative and a woman is sort of an interesting position to be in America. And I was always aware that Tim Russert would always give me a completely, there must be for some word that is different from grilling, an insightful and insight-summoning interview, while also I absolutely knew he was not driven by any political agenda, that he was driven by the desire to find out what's true, what's right, what do you know. So I respected him a lot. Cato Byrne told me once, Cato Byrne of National Review, she wrote a book against abortion, saying America's gone crazy on the issue of abortion, and we have to realize what abortion really is. Well, the mainstream media ignored her. It was like she never wrote a book. Nobody would talk to her. Tim Russert, I think I'm remembering this correctly, called her up and said, "Come be on my show," and asked her about her book. That was so fair, just so unusually fair. So we don't need Republicans asking Republicans questions. We need grown-up, adult, professional journalists who know how to throw the ball straight.
Well stated. We have a question right here.
Oh, sorry.
Sir, we'll go there and there. Okay, you're next. Go ahead.
Thanks for coming to talk to us tonight. It's an honor to be in the same room with you. You're a big part of my Saturday morning. To paraphrase the coffee commercial, you're the best part of waking up Saturday morning. And thank you for sharing your
I
process.
feel for you, sir.
Well, she's the best part, but you're the next best part.
Hello.
Drill down for us a little bit and give us a little bit of an oversight as to, like, what are the 3 to 5 top sources that you kind of monitor for information that you write your columns from?
Do you mean where do I get my information from?
Yeah. You know, what do you find yourself going back to regularly as kind of a go-to source to generate those ideas that you talked about earlier? Thanks.
I talk to a lot of people in Washington who are elective officials because I'm very interested in what's going on in Congress. I don't always write about Congress, but I need to know what's going on there. And I do a sort of a slightly odd thing. Normally, if you are a writer and you call up a congressman or a senator, you are looking for a quote. But that's not what I look for. When you look for a quote on an issue, you're talking to a person who knows he has to be careful because he's about to be quoted in a newspaper that's important. So in an odd way, that gets in my way. So I always I say, please, off the record or not for attribution, please tell me what's happening. And then they open up and they chat away. So I do that a lot. I walk the streets of New York and meet a lot of interesting people and use them as sources. I read a lot. You know, I consider it to be a big part of my job to read a lot. And I read not only books of history, but I read pretty much everything that's out there in journalism. I'm keeping track of things. So that's important to me. And then I sit and reflect. There's a great writer at CBS News, Charles Osgood, the man who anchors CBS Sunday Morning. I met him when he was a young writer at CBS Radio, when I was a somewhat younger writer. And he was, you know, he was a very substantial person who had was an important radio anchorman. And I thought he was just brilliant and really funny, but he had a brilliant and original mind. And I said to him once, when I was a kid working in the newsroom with him, I said, so Charlie, when you're not here and you're not working and you're not doing some studying for work, what do you do? And with complete honesty, he said, I'll never forget this, he said, I like to sit in a chair at home and stare at the wall. In the oddest way, I totally understood that. So I also, to get ideas, sit at home and stare at the wall. I just sort of abstract. I try to unclench my mind a lot. Your mind will tell you what it's really thinking about if you stop working it so hard, you know?
Well done. I know in the very back here, and this probably will be our last question.
Oh my goodness.
What does the fact that a woman who is obviously devoid of any moral center is wiggling
I beg your pardon,
towards
sir.
the White House?
Hey, buddy. Sorry. I'm sorry.
What does the
To
fact
be
that
invited at the Reagan Library, this person. I'm sorry. Sorry.
repeat? What does the fact that a woman who is obviously devoid of any moral center say to you about she's wiggling in and out of all of these questionable questions about her, seems to be Teflon coated, and will be the candidate, the Democratic candidate. What does that say to you about the status or the condition of this country?
Look, I think we are in some kind of crazy, wacky moment politically right now. On the Republican side, if you add up Donald Trump, if you look at the polling of predictable or expected Republican primary voters and who they like, if you add up Donald Trump, Ben Carson, and throw in Carly Fiorina, you have in a lot of polls more than 50% of Republicans on the ground saying to their own political class and their own political leaders, you know, we're looking at you political guys from the Senate, the governorships, the House. We don't even like your experience. We actually think maybe you're part of the problem. You are credentialed, but credentialed people the last 15 years have got us into some terrible fixes, from unwon wars to the Great Recession to a feeble economic recovery. So I think they're saying, we don't want to do that anymore. We want to go, we're looking for different credentials. We've got a big businessman. We've got a business leader in Carly Fiorina. We've got a brain surgeon. We will consider their credentials as maybe something different that we need, because clearly the political stuff hasn't worked. I don't know how that ends, but it fascinates me, and we've never seen it before. This is not a blip with Herman Cain, who's on top for 3 weeks. This is more than 100 days of the Republican base saying, we don't like the politicians, we're looking outside. More than half of them are saying that. On the Democratic side, the most amazing thing, the likely winner of the Democratic nomination is a woman who those Democrats themselves, her supporters on the ground when polled, say, they're asked, do you trust her? Oh, no. Do you think she tells the truth? No, 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 no. Is she a trustworthy person? Alas, not. Okay, so who are you going to vote for? Hillary. I've never seen my country consider actually voting for someone they actually don't trust. I wrote a piece about it once, and I said, really, Democrats? You would really want as your president somebody you don't even trust? You know, we may have a few difficult days ahead. You may want to trust your president when the bombs begin to fall. Do you know what I mean? It's not a meaningless thing that you actually don't trust the words of the person you are supporting for president. So, look, I could not have predicted the things that are happening this year, last year. This year is confounding me, and I'll tell you it's confounding. I don't consider myself a political professional. But it's confounding this year every political professional I know. And is it a compliment to America that it might elect a woman it says it does not itself trust? No, I don't suppose that's a compliment.
Thank you, Peggy. For those who,
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for coming.
for those who don't yet have a copy of Peggy's book, it would really be worth your time to stay for a few minutes. Have it signed, and get one for your friends too. It's an incredible read, I genuinely can say that. So Peggy, once again, maybe one more round of applause for an extraordinary woman.
Thank you, John, very much. We had a good night, didn't we? Thank you, my darling.
If you all could just give us a moment and let our guest depart.